Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Good evening and welcome. We're very pleased to welcome Jonathan Hadley, who's going to be talking this afternoon and presenting and getting you to think about teaching in challenging circumstances. And you'll know if you've watched Jonathan's introductory videos that one of the first things he's going to do is question the very title of this webinar. So I'm sure that will get us off to a good start. So the webinar is being recorded, so you will be able to revisit it. And of course, Jonathan will also tell you or remind you about the mentoring sessions for your CoP activities during his presentation. So without any further ado, Jonathan, welcome.
That's great. Thank you very much. Hello and good evening and welcome to everybody. Let me bring up my slides. I'm delighted to be with you all. As Alan said, the theme for this 2 weeks is teaching in challenging circumstances as I take over from Katie. A couple of housekeeping rules, as we mentioned on the screen. If you could just make sure that your name is in English. I think all of you have done that, so many thanks for doing that. We're just going to keep microphones on mute for the moment, just so there's no interference, but there will be opportunities for you to come on your microphone if you so wish. A little old-fashioned, but perhaps you need some paper and a pen. There will be some tasks that require you to do some writing, and you might want to take notes. So if you're watching this on a mobile phone, you perhaps need something else that you can record some information, because there'll be a writing task at the end. And prayer times, please feel free to leave the webinar at prayer time, which will be different in each country, and then just rejoin us when you can. Any section that you miss, you can catch up with the recording afterwards. Let me just share with you the aims of this webinar. So hopefully you've watched 1 or 2 of my introductory videos. So the focus is on teaching large classes in low resource contexts. And we're going to start off by looking at the advantages, the positives of teaching large classes. And one of the tasks I set to you was to think about what's special about teaching English as a foreign or second language that maybe makes us a little uncomfortable or nervous with large classes. So we're going to explore what is it about learning English as a language that requires us to perhaps plan our classes, deliver our classes, evaluate our classes in a different way to history, maybe science, medical school colleagues who do teach large classes normally. And importantly, we're all teachers, or we're supporting teachers with our communities of practice. So I want to spend most of today's webinar looking at practical strategies, practical activities for delivering communicative language teaching. And in particular, how to engage our students and interact with them, especially when there's such a large class, being able to make each student feel that they are getting attention from the teacher and from their peers, to ensure that everybody gets equal access to the learning and teaching of English in the classroom. So I'd like to start really with the positives, first of all. It's very easy to focus on the negatives of a large class, but as we did in the introduction video, I asked you to think about what are the benefits, what are the positives, even the joys of having a large class. So could you open up your chat box if you haven't got it? Please make sure that it's set to everyone so we can all read. Could you write in the chat box what you think are the benefits or the joys of a large class? That's great, thank you. Lots of nice ideas coming through. More ideas, the vibe, the energy. Great, yes, some are fun and exciting. They're rarely boring. That's true. If you have a one-to-one with a student, that could occasionally perhaps become boring for the students. Competition, right? Because you've got large numbers of people perhaps competing together, or interaction, participation. Thank you. This idea, yep, competitive spirit, competition. Nice ideas coming through. Group work. Inspiring people, yes. So diversity, Hisham's putting in here, yep, different types of intelligence. So we're going to have a whole range of different types of student in the classroom. That's great. And other ones I perhaps would add is if you've got lots of people in front of you, then you're supporting and helping a lot of students. You're helping to develop their English. That's quite rewarding as a teacher, isn't it? Instead of just working with one individual, perhaps we're making a positive impact on a large number. Thank you, Mohammed. Some good ideas coming in there. It's rewarding. Yes, I agree. Rewarding experience. The vibe, the group energy, I was thinking of that. You know, if we harness it in the right way, we have that energy to call upon. And yes, the diversity in terms of different strengths, different skills, different knowledge, different experience from a whole range of students in the room. And I'd also add that we have lots of communication partners. So they're not just working with the same person. If we can vary the partners, then they get a chance to speak to a whole range of different people through the course of their studies with us. Perhaps there is strength in numbers. And I'd like to say at the very beginning, I'm full of admiration for teachers who teach large classes, because I think, as we probably all agree, it's not easy, it's not the optimum size, it's not ideal, but they're making the best of very difficult circumstances. And I take my hat off to teachers who do have these sizable numbers. And as I mentioned in my introduction, perhaps we're thinking here of 40, 50, 60, up to 100 or more students in a space. So of course, that comes with challenges. But let's also look at the positives of a low resource classroom, in that, as I mentioned in the video, we're not talking here about no resources at all, but we're focusing on at least some resources that we have. So again, in the introductory video number 2, I asked you to consider what are the resources we might have if we don't have internet, technology, that type of thing. Well, to give you a little clue, I put some words, some resources on the screen, but I've jumbled them up. So in the chat box, can you unjumble these? Resource number 1, what do you think that is? Can you work out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? What are these resources we can draw upon? Yes, thank you, Yasser. Number 3, indeed. Great, Suleiman, yep. It's almost that, not quite. You've got some of the letters. Have another go. You're in the right area. Few of these. Right, number 1, Rasha, you got the yes, teacher, good, and yes, number 6, indeed, notebook. Yes, Hisham, if number 1's the teacher as a resource, then number 2 has to be the students themselves. They are a great resource for us to draw upon, their knowledge, their experience, their interests. We've got number 4 and number 5 proving a little tricky. It's not quite that. Someone's got them there, yes. Course book, rather than source, it's a course book for that one. And number 5, that one is still missing in the chat box. 2 words. Perhaps an unusual resource, but nonetheless, it's something we can use. Thank you, Kavir. You're right. It's the 4 walls of the room, and we can use them as a space, particularly if it's a large number of students. Those at the back might have difficulty seeing the board or the front wall. So perhaps we can use the other 3 walls around for putting up materials. Anything else that you were thinking of in terms of resources that I haven't got on the screen? Can you add to the chat box other resources in a low resource context that we can call upon? All right, markers, yep. The mother tongue, sure, why not? It's a resource. Just getting a little interference from somebody with a microphone on. If you could switch off your microphone, please. Display charts, yep. So if we can get paper or cardboard or maybe kind of coffee sacks, that type of thing from the market, we can put those on the wall and we can clip or hang or fix to make a display chart. We perhaps have to make our own phoneme chart for that. So yeah, Hisham, a play is an activity, certainly. Flashcards, right, that we can perhaps make if we have access to paper and colors. I appreciate that perhaps many of you here today are not working in a low resource context. So you have access to these. But yes, Mohammed, great. Local resources. So things we can find in the market, we can find in the home, we can bring them into the classroom, or we can ask our students to bring them in. So things like bottle tops can be used for counting. Perhaps string we can use. Putting up string is a way of, like a washing line, we can put a card, we can fix things on that. If we don't have magnetic magnets, or we don't have any like sticky tape to go on there. And yes, you're certainly coming up with activities that we can use. Creativity is really the name of the game, isn't it? That's our biggest resource. Anything we can think of that we can bring into the classroom. And of course, large classes often go hand in hand with other issues. So perhaps there's a lack of space for students to move around. They're all sitting tightly in the room. And that, to my mind, is often a bigger problem than the number of students. It's the space in which they are, because perhaps those at the back have difficulty seeing the board because it's quite far away. There may be a lack of course books. The environment may be uncomfortable. It's too hot or too cold as well. We do have the board, which is a useful resource, but if we're writing on the board, that can be very time consuming. And when we're writing on the board, we have our backs to the students. So that perhaps is something we have to try and overcome. Can we prepare some of our writing in advance and put it on the 4 walls? We might need to make multiple copies so that students can see, those at the back can look at stuff on the walls nearer them. We have to be a bit careful about students coming up to the board to write. Will they write legibly? And if one student is writing, what are the other 59 students doing? Will we be able to read it? Just checking again, microphone, if you can make sure they're off, please. So we do certainly have resources to call upon, but we have to perhaps think creatively how we're going to find them and use them. Nice idea I can see in the chat. So 40 students using a ball. Yes, why not? That is a way of getting their attention and perhaps showing who is going to speak. The student with the ball gets to speak. Another activity we had in the pre-webinar task was to think what makes our subject, so teaching English, different from history, law, or perhaps the medical sciences, where they sit in a lecture room and they're comfortable with 100, 120 students. There's something about our subject, perhaps, that makes that setting not so appropriate. And I asked you, what are the characteristics then of good English language teaching? What are the goals that we need to try and achieve, which the lecture room format perhaps doesn't help us with? And what's therefore the nature of teaching or learning a language? So what I'd like you to do is to take your ideas about our subject, and I'm going to put you into a breakout room in a moment. And I'd like you to share the ideas that you had about our subject. What is special about our subject? And when you've shared your ideas, can you talk together, focusing on those 2 sentences on the screen? For our students to learn English, they need more ... and they need less ... If you want to take a picture of that so that you have it, or you want to just write down those 2 sentences, they need more or they need less. I'm going to ask you in your breakout room to try and complete those sentences. And then we'll be working out what's special about our subject, and therefore what do we need to focus on. So what are the characteristics of our subject? What do students need more of? What do they need less of? We're just going to pause the recording as people go into breakout rooms. Alan, is it possible to... We're just starting the recording again. So those of us who are watching, everybody's been in their breakout rooms and they've been discussing this question of the characteristics of our subject, what makes it different from other subjects, and what do they think our students need more of, or perhaps they need less of in a English as a foreign or second language situation. Great, so I hope you had some interesting discussions there. Let me come back to the PowerPoint slides. So the kind of things that I was talking to people in the breakout rooms or sharing with you all is really that our subject is not just a subject where you take in knowledge or inputs. That doesn't work. We're not just giving facts about English. Our students actually need to use the language, they need to communicate with others, they need to not know about the language, but practically how to use it. So they have to open their mouths, they have to write. And of course, that has implications for the size of the class. A lot of people speaking or a lot of people writing. They need to, I'd say, make mistakes. They need to reflect on those mistakes and they need to get feedback. And again, that can be challenging. How do we give individual feedback to 60, 70 students? And they need lots of practice, but it has to be varied practice. So we give the input, but input with no practice, it's just worthless because students actually have to spend time practicing the grammar, the vocabulary, the skills, not just once, but they have to come back to it, and they have to come back to it over a period of time, kind of distributed practice. Otherwise, the information will go in and it will come out. So lots of things that we have to try and do even in a large classroom. That might be some kind of activity you'd like to explore with your teachers in your communities of practice. So get them thinking about their subject, what is special about it, and then give them those sentences and try and elicit then their ideas about the nature of our subject. The final task I asked you to look at was the kind of controversial one that I set at the beginning, where I said perhaps we shouldn't be focusing on teaching in challenging circumstances, but we should be focusing on the learning part of it. Anybody like to come on the microphone and try and guess what was in my head when I said it should be about learning? Suleiman, I can see you've raised your hand. What would you like to tell us?
Hello, sir. Yeah, so I believe that rather than just teaching is based on the teacher only. I'm just delivering info. But learning is what I need to focus on to ensure that they actually learned. So it's like I'm teaching for the purpose of learning rather than just teaching without like delivering info and that's it. I need to ensure that my students are actually learning rather than just listening to me.
Great, thank you very much. Anybody else like to come on the microphone or the chat box? Yes, Isham. So learner-centered, you said.
Yeah, well, I suppose what I got from your statement here is that the students are the center of the teaching operation. So we need to focus on them, to give them more time, to reduce our TTT, and then give them more time to practice. And I don't know, they are the center of that operation.
Great, thank you. Anybody else like to add to that?
Hello.
Hi.
Okay, I was thinking that teaching can be teaching, we can be teaching the same way everywhere. What the challenging is when we have larger amounts or larger number of learners, it means that we have to change what we teach or how we teach it.
Can you give an example of maybe how we'd have to change?
So to avoid lecturing. Sorry.
Well,
Sorry.
Yeah, that's a
well,
good point.
I think, hello.
Hi, yep, we can hear you.
So the idea is that how can we monitor this large number, what they actually do whenever we do an activity? If you have a smaller number of students, it's much easier to go around, see what they're saying, what they're writing. With large numbers, that's the real challenge. So some way or another, we have to come up with ways to actually have engagement, as we had with Katie. And at the same time, it's not the monotonous method of teaching, which is just laying down the information without actually having students engaged and
That's
producing language.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for mentioning Katie, because there are going to be strong connections across all the themes, but particularly this theme, the idea of how do you engage with, as you see in the picture on the screen, that number of students. So I think rather than focusing on what's the teacher doing, I think it's more important to be looking at, that individual at the back of the class. What kind of experience is that student getting? So rather than what am I doing, I try and look at the planning, the delivery, the evaluation of a lesson, particularly with a large group, but I think it's relevant for all groups, is considering what are my individual students doing? How are they benefiting in the lesson? How are their needs being met? And it's not viewing the class then as just one group, but it's a group of individuals. And in a very large class, of course, they can feel lost in the crowd. So the real focus of today is looking at ways of how we can keep them engaged and busy and learning, not as a group, but as individuals. Because I think if we can get the learning experience right for that one boy at the back of the class, we're probably getting it right for all the students. Here's a little comment. It's an old one now. This is 60 years ago, but I think it's still very relevant. A language is learnt rather than taught. Too much teaching can be an obstacle to learning. So again, the focus needs to be on the learning experience of each student. It's not us lecturing as you might do in history or law. And we need to enhance the learning experience. We know that students learn by processing input, and that input needs to be comprehensible. It needs to be understood by them. And then they need to practice it. So they're not just passively listening to the teacher at the front, talking or lecturing them. And I have a kind of caution here. Many of us perhaps have done our teacher training like the CELTA qualification with a certain type of methodology that's been given to us. But my caution here is that methodology has often been designed in a situation that is not connected with large classes. It's often come from a very small class environment, and particularly a multilingual environment like in London, where you have 8-10 students, all different nationalities, and often the teacher cannot use any of the first languages of those students. So I'd say the things you learnt on your CELTA course or a similar type of teacher training, don't ignore it, but treat it with caution. It might be a useful starting point, or it might be something we can aspire to, but it doesn't mean that what we were taught or given in our training is actually going to work in practice with a large number of students. Instead, it's up to us to experiment and try out things in our own context, because we're the ones who know best. And this is the great advantage of your CoPs, your communities of practice. Perhaps you've got people working in similar situations where they can carry out informal classroom research to find out what works and what doesn't work. So by all means, adopt activities and ideas that come from the more standard training manuals, but don't feel obliged to follow them. Adapt them for your context. See what works in that situation. So we're going to look at a couple of golden rules today that I have put a question mark next to. This has already come up, perhaps, the idea of teacher talking time. If you did a CELTA, you'll have heard your tutor always saying, reduce teacher talking time, less of it. But as we said with our low resource context, the teacher is actually a really useful resource, particularly if you don't have audio, you don't have a reading text, then the teacher becomes that source of information or listening. But the key here is that we should avoid passive listening. And I've got a nice little quote. It's a proverb from Switzerland. And perhaps that's something we want to avoid, isn't it? Just that one teacher at the front talking and everybody else sitting there doing nothing. And it's a question I think we have to ask ourselves in a large class or any class. What are the students doing at every minute of that lesson? Are they benefiting? Are they getting their individual needs met? And if we're not, and we're just lecturing them, then we have to have some justification for that. Is there any point? So perhaps with a large class, standing at the front and giving information, it does have its uses. But I think we have to try and adapt it and evolve it. And what I put at the top there is interactive lecturing. Come up with ways where we speak to the students, but we involve them in that lecturing process. And one of the ways is to just give a small bit of information, a small bit of input, and then throw out a question related to that input and get students in their pairs to reflect on that question together and then feed it back to us. And then we continue the input, we continue the lesson. So we're getting students to interact with us, albeit in pairs rather than one student in the classroom listening. And that way we're involving them, we're engaging them. And it's the old mathematics, isn't it? If one teacher asks one question to one student, that student benefits in 30 seconds, but all the other students are doing nothing. And it's impossible to ask one question to every student, all 60 students. But we can throw out the question and get students reflecting, working together in pairs so that everybody is busy. And another alternative to that is what we call a buzz group. So we, the teacher, speak to the students, and then in groups, perhaps 2 or 4 students, we get them to buzz, speak together like a bee about what they think they heard, what they think they understood. And in their group of 2 or 4, they reflect again on what the teacher was saying. Perhaps they summarize what they think they heard. There could be a question for them to answer, or they make a comment or a suggestion about it. Then they stop their buzzing in their group, and the teacher then continues with the next section of input. And then again, stop your input, get them into their groups and buzzing again, talking and discussing, and you can continue like that for however long you need. The rationale is that students actually are then communicating in their buzz groups. They're reviewing and they're reflecting on what the teacher is talking about. They're processing what the teacher is talking about. They may have a chance to question or comment, and they get the support of their group. Perhaps one person didn't understand what the teacher said, so their friends can peer teach them if they're not clear. And the students are in a group, so there's safety in the group. Instead of putting the spotlight on one student who has to stand up and answer, that's quite uncomfortable for students. So we're breaking up the input into more manageable chunks, and we might get real-time feedback from the students. We can find out what they understood or what they didn't understand. Another technique is called the pose, pause, pounce, bounce technique. So the teacher poses a question to everybody. And then importantly, we pause, we give them thinking time, a minute or longer. I know we're uncomfortable with thinking time, silence, but allow the students to think about their answer. And then pounce on one student and get them to give you feedback. But rather than correcting them or accepting it, bounce the question again onto another student and say, do you have the same opinion? Do you agree? And again, as the teacher, don't give comment, but bounce it on to another student and another student. So many students get the chance to reflect before ultimately it comes back and you can give a final comment. Now, to do this, we need to be selecting students. And I don't like selecting students, at the front and working the way round because that's boring. What are the students doing at the back? They can just sleep because it's not their term. Instead, my advice is to try and prepare little name sticks or name cards. It's a lot of work at the beginning, but once you have those name sticks, you can then pull one name out of it at random and call upon that student. And if you discard the stick, then the sticks that are left, you can select another student and you're not calling upon the same student. And perhaps in the class, you might be selecting 10, 15 different students. So it's a way of ensuring randomly keeping students on their toes because they don't know if they have to answer or not. It's giving a large number of students the chance to answer. Also, we might have the chance to be able to see visually if students understand the input we give them. If they have a notebook, we could get them to turn the notebook one page into a kind of screen where they can write something and then they can show the teacher. This could be, they could write T for true or F for false. I ask a question and they hold up either T or F, or it could be smiley faces. Do they agree, smiley face, or neutral, or a sad one? And again, with 60 or more students, I can quickly see visually everybody's answers. Or they might respond with their bodies. They might stand up if they agree or sit down if they disagree. If it's true, they raise their arms. If it's false, they put their arms on their heads. This sounds like a primary activity, but it can work well with teenagers or even adults if you persuade them that this is a way of getting responses and feedback from our students. So the whole idea is with a large group, we need to be engaging students and we need to be keeping them active and involved. I've got only a short time today, so I'm just going to be able to select certain areas, but when we're focusing on language input, vocabulary or grammar, it's very important that our students can say the words, and drilling can be a really effective way of supporting the meaning of a word or grammar point, and of course the form of it as well. And if we want our students to be able to speak the language, then they have to open their mouths. And the idea of us modeling the language and getting students to repeat, that helps to reinforce the patterns of language and it contributes to students' fluency. The key thing for me about drilling is we've got to keep it fun, just keep it short. It's got to be interactive. So me modeling and then the students responding. And short bursts of drilling, I think, are better than a kind of long pronunciation activity. Just a few minutes in every lesson activates students and gets them speaking. So how many different ways do you know for drilling in the chat box? Do you like drilling? Is it something you do? What are the different ways we can drill? Please share with us in the chat box. Hisham did it yesterday. Great, you're a fan like me. Thanks, Javier. Yes, it is effective for large groups. Any techniques you know? Okay, thanks for that example, Hisham. Back chaining, I'll come to that in a minute in case people aren't aware of it. Yeah, clapping out the syllables, so the rhythm of it. So Suleiman's talking about you say can, I say you, and so you're getting the different forms. So I can, he can, right? So you can get the third person form, perhaps the negative form. Rasha, changing your voice when drilling. Okay, certainly at the primary level, you might have an excited voice. You might have the voice of a lion. Different ways, different characters. Yes, exactly, different characters. Nice. Thanks, Javier, for sharing that sample. Examples I'm thinking, of course, we can get all the students together in a group to repeat after ourselves, the teacher, when we model it. We can also do 50-50, so we can split up the group. So this side repeat, and then this side repeats. We could do rows, so the first row repeat, the second row repeat, breaking it up. And then eventually you might get round to individual repetition. And again, that's where these little name sticks would be useful, because we can randomly select the name of a student and ask them to repeat. And that's keeping everyone on their toes. We can do it in pairs as well, individuals. So across the room in open pairs, one person in the corner, say it, person in the far corner, repeat it, or they could do question and answer. Or closed pairs with the person next to you, say it to your friend listens and then repeats it back, building in variety all the time. Here's the one Mohammed mentioned, back chaining. So the idea here is instead of getting students to repeat from the front of the sentence, I like walking, it's very robotic, it's not natural English, we don't get the rhythm and intonation. With a longer phrase or a sentence, it actually works starting at the back, the end of the sentence, and building up from it, because you get the natural rhythm and sentence stress and word stress of the phrase. So let's try it together with your microphones off, otherwise it will be chaos. Please repeat after me. Park. The park. In the park. Walking in the park. I like walking in the park. You can see we build it up and we get that rhythm, that natural flow of the language. Useful for longer phrases and sentences. Try it. Half chorus, I sort of mentioned with open pairs. So we can get one side of the room to ask the question and the other side to do the answer, and then they can swap, so questions and answers. We could also give a slight change in the drill. So we could ask students to change one word. If you're doing the time, for example, you could change the time on the clock. And you can see on the screen, that's kind of how it would work. The teacher, again, randomly selecting a student. So Fatima, and Fatima makes the sentence with the grammar structure. He gets up at 6 o'clock. I then change the time and I say Miriam. And now Miriam has to change that one small part of the sentence. So he gets up at 6:30 and it can go round the room. Again, variety, keep it fast, keep it fun. If you're going to correct students, just do it a little bit. We don't want to embarrass them, and give them good models of the language. And perhaps this is something you might want to explore with your teachers in your community of practice. Perhaps you want to focus on a language point, and then think of what kind of drills would you do? How would you do the drill? And then with your fellow teachers, actually try it out on them. They can be the students. Have some practice at doing back chaining or turning it into a cue response drill. That might be a fun activity to do with your teachers. But again, perhaps don't spend too long on it. As you can see, I'm a big fan of getting students as quickly as possible into pairs and groups. With a large group, that helps it break up into much smaller groups who can work together and communicate and support each other. I tried to get you into a breakout room pretty early on in this webinar to give you a chance to work as a smaller group rather than just listening to me talk or listening to one person talk. We need to think of ways that we can get our students into pairs and groups. If the students can't move, then perhaps they just have to speak to the student in front or behind, on their left, on their right, or perhaps students in a row can talk to each other. And again, vary this. And if the students can't move, then it's me, the teacher, who perhaps needs to move and engage with the different groups and pairs. So hopefully the layout of the room at least allows me, the teacher, to move around. But pair work and group work, it gives space for the individual and it keeps them active in their pair or in their group rather than sleeping in the whole class. But to do this, we need to give the groups a role. We need to give them a purpose. There has to be a focus for their collaboration. If we just say get into pairs, what's the purpose of getting into a pair? There has to be something they need to do. One technique you might be familiar with is the think, pair, share. So teacher asks a question and then the students think about it individually and then form a pair. And in their pair, they share their ideas. What were they thinking about? And then, of course, finally, they could share with the rest of the class as well. So it's a way of giving a purpose to that pair, that they are focusing on a specific question, which they know that they will then perhaps share with another pair or the whole class. Another activity I like to do, a dice. It's a relatively simple resource. Even if you don't have a physical dice, you can easily make a dice. With a large number of students, they probably can't see a small dice. So come up with a box, a cardboard box. And then on the side of the box, you're going to write the numbers. This is just a small box for my video screen here, but a supermarket large cardboard box with the 6 numbers on. If you roll that at the front of the class, all the students should be able to see it. You can probably even throw the cardboard box to allow other students to roll it. And the idea is it's a very versatile tool. Obviously, there are 6 numbers. We can put a task or a language point or vocabulary next to each number, and we can use that as a way of creating a communicative activity. On the screen, next to each number, I've put some grammar structures, some questions. What do you think is the grammar that I'm trying to teach on the board, on the screen? What's the focus of this communicative activity? Yep, thanks, Suleiman. It's the present perfect and something else. I'm contrasting the present perfect with that's right. Thank you, Rasha. The simple past, the past simple. That's right. So it's getting them now to speak about it with some freer practice. So the idea is I just roll the dice and it comes out 2. And then I'm going to ask students. My tip here is put students into groups of 3. A and B are going to talk about when was the last time. Sorry, I can't quite read the screen. I'm covered. When was the last time you watched a movie? And the third student is going to listen to their conversation, perhaps take notes and give feedback. So working in a group of 3. So let's try. I'm going to roll the dice. We'll use the chat box rather than speaking. It's come out at number 4. So in the chat box, what did you do at the weekend when you were small? Can you write a sentence, present perfect or past simple, please? What did you do at the weekend when you were small? Great. Nice examples. So of course, the focus for our students is, can they use the past simple here? Although I noticed used to, right? That was extra bonus points for using I used to do something when I was small. So good past simple verbs coming through. And rather than writing, of course, this is where I'd get the students to speak. So building in pair and group work as much as possible. Perhaps this is something you might want to consider again for your community of practice. Could you share this idea of the dice with your colleagues? What would they put next to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? There's a whole different way of using those numbers. It doesn't just have to be questions. It could be topics, it could be skills, it could be vocabulary. You can probably think of any number of ways that this flexible resource can be used to generate activities for our students to do in pairs or small groups. Another golden rule of teaching. Do you agree with it? In the chat box, yes, no, maybe. What would be your response? A big no from Kavya. Well, I'm very pleased to see no, because otherwise I might be having difficulty with the next part, because that's what I also agree, that there are other people, namely the students, who can also give feedback. And of course, with a large group, feedback on writing is particularly challenging. I know that all the activities we do require feedback, but just for the purposes of this webinar where my time is limited, I'm just going to focus on writing, giving feedback for that. Some ideas, 60 students in the room, if they're all writing, how can we give feedback to each individual? It is a challenge and there isn't a perfect answer here, but there are perhaps some strategies that we could use. The teacher can walk around while the students are writing, and you can stand next to random individual students and try and correct what they're doing. One little tip, if you read their work and you're correcting it and they are still writing and you've only seen perhaps half of it, put a tick next to the place that you corrected, so that when the student gives it to you next time, you don't have to read through the whole thing again. You can see exactly where you got up to and you know what's been corrected. And again, it would be perhaps randomly checking a few copies. Also, teachers can individually perhaps correct a group of students. So you focus on the front row this week, and then next week you focus on the second row. It can be perhaps impossible to correct every student's writing every week if you've got 60 students. So the best we can maybe do is just to try and focus in depth a certain number of students and then roll it out so that everybody at some point gets their writing corrected in depth. Also focus on just one or two areas rather than trying to correct everything. Here we need to look at the learning objective. What is the focus of the writing? For example, I might not focus on the spelling, I might focus on the layout of the writing or the paragraphing, because that's the learning objective. Perhaps I just don't have time to correct everything. And if I do correct everything, will the students appreciate seeing all that feedback? Or is it better just to focus on a narrow range of mistakes, errors? But also with feedback, important that we focus on the positives too. And in particular, we try to respond to the message that our students are writing. So it's not just the grammar errors, but focusing on what we like and, you know, the message, the content, making a comment on that. The content is as important as the grammar and the spelling. Suleiman, did you have a question? Did you want to come in there? Or are you okay? Yes, do you want to come on the mic?
Well, hello, sir. I was just asking, what if I try to split the responsibility between me and other students? Like I assign certain leaders in every group, okay, and give the instructions or whatever I want to give feedback, or provide them with a rubric or a certain criteria for them to assess the work of their colleagues. This way, I don't have just one teacher, I have like other co-teachers in the same class helping me as well.
Brilliant. And that's my next PowerPoint slide. Peer correction. Of course, we said students are a resource and they can be a resource for giving feedback. So thank you very much for preparing the way for me. I think the key point here is, as you said, they need some rubric, they need some marking criteria. And we have to be quite specific about that so that they are focused and they know what they are looking for and that they're not just looking for the negatives as well. So yes, we can involve students in the feedback process, peer feedback or peer correction. So I've taken a text here from a resource that has been used in Saudi Arabia in the past. It's a writing text and they get a model. So they get to see what they have to write, but you'll notice that in question C, students have to write a short email about an incident, something that made your family happy or proud, to a pen pal. Exchange your emails in pairs and discuss them. Well, that exchange your emails in pairs is going to be where the peer correction comes in. But we do need to help our students. We need to give them training in what they're looking for when they are looking at the writing and giving corrections and all. So just have a look at the task, have a look at the model. What do you think you might ask your students to give feedback on? What would be the areas that they could perhaps do it successfully? What might you focus on when it comes to feedback in this particular writing task? Answers in the chat box, please. Content, certainly, and yeah, genre side. I guess by that you mean the email genre. So it's got to be an email, and we know that has a certain layout. So that could be something that their friends could help them with. They could check, give feedback on. Anything else that they could perhaps comment on? Vocabulary, certainly. Email to a friend, so it's going to be fairly informal vocabulary as well. Have they got the right register? They certainly could rephrase it, so they could take chunks of it, especially the weaker students can use the model and just make one or two changes perhaps for that. The good thing is, while peer correction is happening, this frees up the teacher. All the students are busy peer correcting, and the teacher, of course, could be going around monitoring and supporting individual students. You could also use the time if you need to write something on the board. So everybody is busy. you're free. You have an opportunity to help individuals, go to groups, go to pairs, or prepare for the next part of the lesson. Here's a suggestion, and it's just a suggestion. It's going to very much depend on the level of your students, what you think that they'd be good at correcting. But you'll notice at the top, I'm asking them to respond with smiley faces. Again, I need to train them up that the smiley face is a good job. The neutral face, rather than the sad one, because that's a bit strong, the neutral, they need to do a little bit more work. So I'm showing the teacher student, the one who is correcting, the areas that they should be focusing on, and then they can give comments. Those comments at a higher level, students maybe will write some things or they'll put the corrections. At a lower level, they might just copy either the smiley face or the neutral face to alert their friend that something is fine or something needs extra work on it. And we do need to train our students. I keep stressing that. I put the starting and the ending of the email. They could check that. There were 6 questions that they had to respond to. So have they got answers to all 6 questions? They could check the verbs because the event is in the past. So is it a past verb? Perhaps just something as simple as a capital letter at the beginning of every sentence. They could go through and they could check that their friend has done that. Did they understand the email? A really important part. And final comments. They could maybe write something to their friend, but with my training, I'll be telling them, you know, focus on the positives. So 3 stars and a wish is a nice technique to encourage them to do. 3 stars, so comment on 3 things you thought were really good about your friend's writing, and then 1 wish for your friend. What would you wish that they'd do maybe differently in draft 2? That's kind of looking at the error or the repair part. Again, this is just a sample on the screen. The format, the layout, it will depend very much on the level of your students. I notice in the chat box, the hardest part is good preparation. So we do have to support our students. Maybe we have to use mother tongue here so that they're clear about what the job is, and we're focusing on the positives as much as the areas to correct or improve. Perhaps this is a CoP activity you'd like to do with your teachers. Just select a writing task and then come up with a rubric for that level of student. Then the teachers have something to take away and use in their own classes. Another golden rule of teaching. What do you reckon with this one? Answers in the chat box. Don't use the first language, the mother tongue, perhaps Arabic in our context. Agree, disagree, maybe? Right, more maybes than anything else. Yeah, I kind of agree with you, maybe. Back when we looked at resources, I said, well, or somebody said, I think the mother tongue, first language, it is a resource, it's a tool. And like any tool, we can use it well, we can use it badly, we can use it in different circumstances. I think this rule of no first language, again, it comes from a very narrow set of teaching circumstances, probably where the teacher didn't actually know the first language. It seems a shame for me not to use it sometimes, but I stress the word sometimes. If we use it appropriately, it can be supportive. It depends on the age of the students, the level, what we're using it for. Hisham, right, they answer with their mother tongue, so perhaps I don't use it as a teacher, but I can, I can check their understanding for that. And certainly low achieving learners. I have to say, I studied Arabic at Cambridge University. It's quite a good university. I did not study Arabic in Arabic. There was a lot of English used. They didn't see a problem with it. I didn't see a problem with it. It helped me a great deal. They didn't use English all the time, but I think it certainly has a place. And one place with a large group of students might be that we could use it for writing. And the article on the bottom, it's a really interesting article about different strategies for teaching English. Jason Anderson focuses on back translation. It's a way of getting a large number of students to be writing something in English with minimal correction required from the teacher. How does this work? Well, we give students a text. So here's an example from a resource that was used in Saudi Arabia. It's a descriptive text about Taif, and it's obviously got kind of descriptive language, and it's a recommendation, like a travel tourism recommendation. So the verbs have a picnic. It's kind of encouraging people to come and visit Taif. So the idea is you study the features of the text, the language, the grammar, the vocabulary with the students. So they're looking at the English. And then you ask them to translate it into their mother tongue, the whole text. Then you remove the English text, and only using their translation, they have to produce the original English text again. So they translate it back, and then they compare their translation with the original one, and they can perhaps check the differences. They could self-correct anything different, or they could do some peer correction for that. I think we have time, and I said hopefully you have a pen and paper. I'm assuming here that you all have another language, or you're comfortable with another language. So on your pen and paper, can you try and translate this passage? For time, you might just want to do one sentence. There are two here. Can you now write a translation into Arabic or whatever language you're comfortable? And actually, you're gonna need it, so it does need to be written down on paper. So I'll give you a few minutes. Please translate the text into another language. When you finished either doing the whole text or just one sentence, can you put perhaps a thumbs up on the screen so I can see you've had enough time? Thank you. Suleiman, is that a thumbs up or is it a question?
No, actually, yeah, I'm a thumbs up. I'm sorry, that was my mistake.
Okay,
Okay, so
That's
yes, I'm
fine.
done.
Great.
All right.
As long as perhaps you've got the first sentence, it will show you how this activity works. Okay, for time purposes, I'm going to move on. So the second part is that I'm going to remove the English text. Okay, so now can you recreate the original text using your translation, even if it's just the first sentence? Give you a few minutes. Have a go. Again, when you've done the translation, if you can give me a thumbs up, and I know I can move on. Okay, for time purposes then, the moment you're waiting for to see what the original was. And you can compare then your back translation, translated from mother tongue back into English, with the original. It's not an activity I would use every time, but I think it's certainly useful to put in our teaching suitcase. I think it can be done at most levels, if not all levels, depending on the text that we choose. It's acknowledging the importance of the mother tongue in the learning process. It's engaging all our students, and particularly with a large group. I think there's probably less correction required once students have been through this process than if they just had to produce something original from scratch without that model in front of them. But there's still very deep levels of processing going on, and the importance of being, bilingual, biliterate, using your first language as a tool in the second language learning process. So again, perhaps this is something you might want to try out in your CoPs, your community of practice. If you liked the idea, maybe if you didn't like the idea, you could say, Jonathan came up with this. Is it worth it? What do you think of it? Give them a text, get them to translate it, remove the original, and then back translate from it. What are the strengths of it? What are the challenges? What are the weaknesses? But I certainly think if you have a very large number of students and it's minimizing the amount of correction required by the teacher, then hopefully that can only be a good thing. So that's kind of bringing me to the end of my presentation. There's lots more I could talk about with teaching large classes, and I've only had a few opportunities to focus on certain areas of English language syllabus, curriculum, and teaching. But I hope there are ideas, at least one or two, that are new to you or interesting. But importantly, as I said, with any methodology you get, they might not work as they are, but perhaps you can take ideas and aspects from it and adapt it to your own context, work with it, try it out. You certainly don't have to take those as golden rules from Jonathan. I've summarized on this screen the possible CoP activities that you could cascade or deliver to your teachers now after this webinar. So in the next 2 weeks, the focus moves to your CoP, where we would like you then to bring your teachers together and explore one activity or more. The first activity was that breakout room activity, where we looked at what's the nature of our subject and reflecting then on, if this is the characteristic of the subject, how do we practically bring about the learning of English in our classrooms? Students need to do more speaking, they need to be more engaged, more pair work, more group work, with perhaps less teacher lecturing, unless it's interactive lecturing. Or you might choose to focus on drilling if you enjoyed that, or you think it's an area that your teachers might want more support with. So choose a language focus. It could be grammar, vocabulary, or functional language. It can be individual words, or it could be longer phrases and sentences. Think about how you would drill these with variety, engaging a large number of students, and then actually just try it out among the teachers with them being the students. It's good to have some practice in a safe environment before you go out into the classroom and try it. Maybe back chaining is something you've heard of but haven't done, or it's a little refresher. Perhaps you haven't done it for a while. The dice activity, would you like to share that with your teachers? And again, what would you have as those 6 criteria on the board? Would it be a grammar focus? Would it be a speaking topic or a writing topic focus? Peer correction, perhaps that's something you'd focus with your teachers on if they don't do much of it, but they'd be more interested in. So designing the rubric and coming up with the right kind of layout that's appropriate for your students. So if it's primary level, it's probably just going to be smiley faces, isn't it? Or coloring in the smiley faces. But peer correction, I think, can be done at pretty much any level, even thumbs up, thumbs down, kindergarten. Or that last task, translation, back translation. You might want to surprise your teachers if they don't think that they should be using the mother tongue. Give them an opportunity to see where it can be useful, appropriate, and effective. Or finally, you might want to look at most of the things I've been talking about in one activity. So my suggestion here is go to the course book if you happen to use a course book, select one activity or perhaps one page, one lesson, 45 minutes, 50-minute class, and then get your teachers to explore it. What will the teacher be giving in terms of input? And importantly, from my webinar, how can they make that input interactive? And there you could share those ideas of a buzz group or holding up notebook pages so that students are responding. Getting them to plan what the students will actually be doing when they're doing that task or that page of the book. Can we engage all the students? Can we engage them all the time? Can we build in pair work, group work, so that the class is dynamic and interactive? And then perhaps explore with them the feedback. At which stage of the activity or the page would feedback occur? Who will give that feedback, the teacher or a student? How will that feedback take place? So this kind of CoP activity hopefully integrates all aspects of my webinar. The webinar is being recorded, so you might want to show sections of it. That's really all from me, only to say that Sunday is when the first mentoring session will start. This is mentoring to help you with the CoP activity. You can come and tell me what you're thinking of doing with your group of teachers. If you have any questions about it, I'll support you as much as I can. It's on Sunday and it's at 6 o'clock Saudi Arabia time. The first 40 minutes will be with group 1, and then at 6:40 it will be open to all. And as I mentioned in my introduction video, each day a different group will have a mentoring opportunity, but there's always time for everybody to take part. So preparation mentoring, you do your CoP activity, and then the second mentoring, you'll be coming back to reflect and give feedback on how your CoP activities went. And I very much look forward to hearing about them. If you have any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them, or come on to the WhatsApp chat and I'll try and answer them there. So thank you very much for being with me today, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.